Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 45, Jericho. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new members of the Patreon House of Lords, Earl Darwin's Dummy, Earl Jose Ferreira, and Earl Will Stevens. Philip Allen has also been promoted from the Marquess of Beaumont and Cresford to the Duke of Beaumont and Cresford. If you'd like to join their ranks and not only listen to the podcast ad-free, but help support the show, then go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Thank you to all of my patrons. This podcast wouldn't exist without you. Last time, we saw the Major Generals firmly lose favour with Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell. If the Protectorate was a military dictatorship, as its critics believed, what happens when the dictator rejects the military? Enter the civilian faction. These were traditionalists, lawyers, nobility, moderate Presbyterians, who had spent the whole parliamentary session working on another constitutional settlement. They hoped it would finally bring the country together, heal the divisions of 20 years of civil war and revolution, and avert more violence and a Stuart restoration. The humble petition and advice was debated in Parliament, passed by a majority vote, and presented to the Lord Protector at the end of March 1657. If Oliver Cromwell accepted it, he would become a king. Cromwell thanked the Speaker and the Parliament for the humble petition and advice, and requested a few days to consider it. When Cromwell was formally presented with the humble petition and advice, it wasn't completely out of the blue. He was not involved in drafting it, and he was pointedly not involved in the parliamentary debates around it. He'd also been staying away from the meetings of the Council of State. But this didn't mean he wasn't kept up to date about it. So he knew immediately that there was a lot to like in the humble petition. He particularly liked the idea of a nominated other house, as well as the firm commitment to religious toleration. The main stumbling block was, of course, the title of king. To accept it would be the path of least resistance, constitutionally speaking at least. Parliament had voted on him taking the title, and it would revert the three kingdoms back into exactly that. Kingdoms with established precedent and expectations. So Cromwell took those 3 days, spoke to his advisers, wrote to his family, and prayed to God. And then, on the 3rd of April, he gave Parliament his answer. No. He liked almost all of the humble petition, but he could not accept the title of king. Quote, "I have not been able to find in my duty to God and you to undertake this charge under that title. It is my conscience that guides me." End quote. Well, that just wouldn't do. Parliament immediately appointed a committee of 99 and charged it with persuading the Lord Protector to accept the humble petition and advice in its entirety. Cromwell agreed to meet with this committee in what became known as the kingship debates. Faced with arguments grounded in faith, in law, in constitutionality, and in practicality, Cromwell gave as good as he got. Quote, "I will not seek to set up that which Providence hath destroyed and laid in the dust, and I would not build Jericho again." End quote. Over April 1657, the Lord Protector was pulled in two directions. The civilian faction were pushing Cromwell to accept the crown. In addition to his regular meetings with the larger committee, Cromwell also debated it with smaller groups in the meeting chambers of Whitehall Palace. He also discussed it over tobacco and card games in his private apartments. The moderates had strong arguments in favour of the crown, and they asked him what the alternative would be. Parliament had been clear. The humble petition and advice had to be accepted or rejected as one. He could not pick and choose. If Cromwell wanted a new constitutional settlement, one which had been drafted and agreed by an elected Parliament, then he had to accept their proposal. he had to take the crown. But Cromwell was being pulled in the opposite direction too. Though on the back foot in Parliament since the defeat of the Militia Bill, the Major Generals had been fighting the humble petition and advice at every step. Outside of Parliament, they had used every method they could to apply pressure to their Commander-in-Chief. Many of them were on the Council of State, but Cromwell had only rarely been present recently. But the Lord Protector knew the vast majority of his officers, the men who had fought by his side for years, were against a return to monarchy, even under him. Their personal ties and connection with the Lord Protector were levered. Charles Fleetwood and John Desborough, family members by marriage to Cromwell, along with John Lambert, threatened to resign their commissions if he took the crown. Pulled in these two opposite directions, Cromwell turned to his own conscience. For 4 weeks, the Lord Protector wrestled with the question of a crown. He prayed, he fasted, he sought spiritual guidance from outside his close circle. The Quaker leader George Fox was one of these as they met in Hyde Park. Fox urged Cromwell to leave the crown where God had left it, in the gutter. Cromwell's servants and friends recorded how they heard him sobbing and begging God for a sign. After weeks of internal debate and meetings large and small, with arguments and pleas and petitions and letters and impromptu park meetings and formal Parliament committee sessions, no one knew what the Lord Protector would decide. Finally, on the 8th of May, after weeks of deliberation, the Lord Protector once again summoned Parliament to the banqueting house. It was apparently quite easy to get bored during one of the Lord Protector's speeches. People had been known to doze off at times. It's safe to say that everyone paid attention this time. The civilian faction were optimistic. Cromwell had hinted in the previous days that he had come over to their side and that he would accept the crown. But to their shock and horror, and to the joy of others, he once again bluntly refused it, saying, quote, "I cannot undertake this government with that title of king, and that is my answer to this great, weighty business." End quote. Now Cromwell made his own proposal. He would accept the rest of the humble petition and advice. Now this was directly against the Speaker's earlier insistence that the humble petition could not be amended further. But Cromwell was effectively turning one of the civilian faction's arguments back on them. There was no alternative to this new constitution. He called their bluff. 10 days later, the Lord Protector's position had still not changed. In fact, since giving his answer, Cromwell was positively glowing. He had so dreaded going against God's will, and now he'd made his decision against taking the crown, he felt relief. Parliament was less happy. Half of the members stopped attending, thoroughly demoralised by the Lord Protector. Many viewed this as Cromwell once again bowing to the army. A vote was passed to amend the humble petition to replace King with Lord Protector. Compared to the original vote, which had been carried by a 2/3 majority, this won by a single vote. It was hardly a ringing endorsement of the new constitution. Parliament continued to sit throughout May and into June. The date of its proroguing was decided for the 26th of June. It was only a few days before this that John Desborough helpfully rose and reminded the House that the humble petition and advice needed to be put into effect. That is, the Lord Protector still had to give his assent to it. The House decided to make an event of it. Cromwell would be formally invested, once again, as Lord Protector. Cromwell's second investiture was held on the 26th of June. His new oath, hastily agreed by Parliament, bound him to uphold the Protestant faith, preserve the rights and privileges of the people, and govern England, Scotland, and Ireland according to law. There was a prayer, and then, heralded by a trumpet, Oliver Cromwell was proclaimed the Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. "God save the Lord Protector" rang out through the hall. In the aftermath, MPs in the Council of State swore an oath to the Lord Protector. There was a notable absence. John Lambert hadn't attended the investiture ceremony, and he now refused to take the new oath. He saw the humble petition and advice for what it was, for what the civilian faction had intended it to be, a shift in the balance of power away from the army. Also, I have to imagine he was more than a bit annoyed that his baby, the instrument of government, had been altered. By refusing to accept the new constitution and swear the new oath, Lambert effectively forced Cromwell's hand. He retired to Wimbledon House with a comfortable pension. His garden would occupy his time as he waited for the political winds to change. They always had before, after all. With his second investiture, the rest of the humble petition and advice was slowly put into practice. The Council of State was renamed the Privy Council. Cromwell began putting together his list of appointees to the Other House. 63 notable men were chosen, representing a range of political positions. A third of them received a letter from the Lord Protector, inviting them to take their seat in the new constitutional order, and said, "Yeah, no thanks." Cromwell's allies were much more likely to accept their new duty, but this was a mixed blessing. By elevating his strongest supporters, it often meant removing them and their influence from the House of Commons. There were other elements of the new constitution which remained vague, or which would never be put into practice. On the vague side of the page, we can place the succession. The humble petition and advice stated that the Lord Protector would nominate his own successor. Great. But when and how would he do this? For the rest of 1657, Cromwell appeared to be preparing his eldest surviving son, Richard, to be his heir. Richard would become Chancellor of Oxford, replacing his father. Richard would be appointed to both the new Privy Council and to the Other House. But Cromwell refused to officially nominate him as his successor. Maybe this was his aversion to a hereditary succession, but it caused no end of anxiety for the Protectorate's supporters. On the to-do list were elements like the Confession of Faith, long wished for by Presbyterians, but which was never completed. On more earthly matters, the humble petition also didn't settle on the franchise. How many seats and who could vote for them in Scotland and Ireland was left up in the air. What kind of representation would the other two kingdoms, never mind Wales, have in the other house? And it left open a very Stuart question. What kind of union was there going to be between the three kingdoms? If this was a purely personal union, did that still work without a king? The humble petition and advice was a step towards stability, but there were many more steps to go. For the moment, the person of Oliver Cromwell remained the sole load-bearing column of the new order. Maybe he could reinforce the whole system, polish off the humble petition, fill out the constitutional gaps it left, and bolster it with the most powerful and effective material for any institution: time. But time was the one thing Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell did not have. Cromwell was not well. He'd never been particularly healthy for as long as we've known him, but now he was in his late 50s. Not old by any stretch, but no longer a spring chicken. But he was not dead yet, and he still held uncontested authority over the army which had raised him up. After Parliament was prorogued, he invited 200 army officers to a feast, where he plied them with wine and then spoke for 2 hours. Afterwards, they cheered his name and swore loyalty to their Lord Protector. Of course, not everyone was on the same page, particularly among the army grandees. Cromwell met with 6 of them to discuss their concerns, but when they still insisted that he had abandoned the good old cause, he summarily fired them. There was no courts-martial or appeal. Major Packer, one of those kicked out, recalled that, quote, "With the breath of his nostrils, I was outed," end quote. When Fifth Monarchists attempted to spark a mutiny with pamphlets, they instead sparked a swell of grassroots support, carefully cultivated by Cromwell's supporters. Addresses of loyalty from officers in all 3 kingdoms flowed into Whitehall. This final purge of critics from the army even well-known figures like John Lambert, didn't trigger any reaction. As Ian Gentle sums up, "From then until the time of his death, there was no challenge to Cromwell's authority from within the army." The Second Protectorate Parliament had not been dissolved in June 1657, but merely prorogued, and so it straddled the two constitutions. The second session gathered in late January 1658, this time under the Humble Petition and Advice. The most immediate change was that clause of the Humble Petition which forbade the Protector or the Privy Council from blocking MPs from their seats, which meant that those MPs purged at the beginning of Parliament were now welcome to return. 20 of them did, including Sir Arthur Haselrig. Cromwell offered Haselrig a seat in the other house, partly in recognition of his status, but also to get him out of the Commons. Haselrig declined, and insisted on swearing his oath to the Protector as an MP. The return of these vocal critics of the regime was magnified by the elevation of so many Cromwellian supporters to the other house. Cromwell opened the session with a speech which, to be honest, wouldn't have been out of place at any of his other parliaments. He urged the Parliament to find unity and to heal and settle the nation. The returning Commonwealth's men were not swayed. It did not take long for the Lord Protector to hear rumours that they were drafting a petition for a return to a single House of Parliament, undoing all of the work of the Humble Petition and Advice. Cromwell marched back into the chamber. He gave a speech which also wouldn't have been out of place in any of his previous parliaments. With rage and fury, the Lord Protector railed against the Parliament for seemingly going back on its own idea, and he dissolved it. The second session of the Second Protectorate Parliament lasted all of 2 weeks. This last year of Oliver Cromwell's life went by with only a few affairs of state, but with many personal triumphs and tragedies. He saw 2 of his daughters marry. One of them, Elizabeth, died soon after. He was devastated, and this did not help his own health. We can track Cromwell's failing health through his signature. What had once been a firm and flowing mark was, from letter to decree to letter, turning into a shaky scribble. There were some bright moments, mostly militarily. Despite the domestic political troubles, the financial backing of London's merchants had remained solid, and the Protectorate remained a force to be reckoned with. Now, that isn't to say the government wasn't in debt, because it seriously was, but there was enough confidence that new loans were always forthcoming. Well-funded Commonwealth forces captured the Spanish-held port city of Dunkirk. England's enemies no longer had a port on the Channel from which to raid and threaten invasion, so long as France and the Netherlands remained friendly, of course. In Jamaica, after months of struggle against the climate, guerrilla warfare, and disease, the garrison was still there, repeatedly reinforced with new bodies. Cromwell had insisted that the occupation fortify the island, and this put them in a good position when the Spanish finally returned in October 1657. They were unable to make any headway. A skirmish left 100 Spaniards dead on the field at the cost of only 4 British redcoats. In November, the Spanish were reinforced, but a force of Marines, the predecessors to the Royal Marines, attacked their positions. More than 300 were killed in the attack, leaving the Iberians on the back foot, and the British with 10 captured standards. Cromwell received word of the first skirmish in April 1658. It was a good sign. But when news of the second attack was sent to London, complete with the captured standards, it arrived too late. Oliver Cromwell died on the 3rd of September 1658, on the same day as his greatest victories at Dunbar and Worcester. He had ruled the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland as Lord Protector for nearly 5 years. He had been the most powerful single person in England for 3 years before that. He had risen from relatively humble birth, and through merit and luck became the victor of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. He had been born in the house of landed gentry, and died in the palace of Whitehall. He could have been king, but when offered the crown, he turned it down. How do we judge him? Critics of Cromwell have long claimed his motivation since the Civil Wars was ambition, and that he wanted to become king. Even contemporaries raise this possibility. How many times have I mentioned, with amazingly subtle and well-crafted foreshadowing, that this MP or that officer feared the popularity of the rising star of Cromwell? And many historians have come to this conclusion, either brushing over his rejections of the crown, or by representing it as him wanting to be king, but being threatened by the army, or, and this has the most credibility of the three in my opinion, he just didn't like the title of king. After all, as Lord Protector, he was far freer in his actions than a king would have been. He wasn't supported by precedent, but he also wasn't bound by it either. Cromwell became the example of a military strongman who makes himself ruler, at least until a certain Corsican artillery officer dislodges him. But though people still accuse Cromwell of wanting to be king, I just don't see it. Cromwell had plenty of opportunities to seize the crown if he wanted it. I mean, this wasn't even the first occasion he'd been directly offered one, but each time he chose a different path. And I think that more than deciding whether he wanted a specific title, we should look at his actions in the 8 or so years he was the most powerful person in 3 kingdoms. I don't think Cromwell wanted to be an absolute ruler, even though he had the power to make that happen. He kept returning to power sharing. He kept trying to work with parliaments, whether that was the Rump, or Barebones, or his 2 Protectorate parliaments. He was repeatedly given the chance to work without them, or to bypass them, but he kept coming back. Not always enthusiastically, to be fair. Cromwell had his frustrations with all the parliaments, but it was usually because of specific issues, mostly their attacks on religious toleration. And yet, he kept trying. Now, that's not to say he wasn't an egomaniac or an autocrat. He was. He absolutely believed he knew best, that his country and his God needed him to act, and he was fully prepared to use his control over the military to override civilian authority. But did he want to be king, or a king in all but name? I don't think so. But I'm interested to know what you think, so please get in touch. He was a man of contrasts. He could hold 2 mutually exclusive positions at once. For example, he has a statue today outside the Palace of Westminster, erected by the Victorians as a hero of parliaments. He believed in Parliament and the importance of elected government, and yet he dissolved as many parliaments as Charles I did, with similar frustration as his royal predecessor. He could be quite politically savvy, and for most of his reign he balanced the demands of the army which backed him with the civilians he wished to give power to. But the army was also the greatest threat to the new order. He never firmly rid himself of it, and it would be to his successor's detriment. His principle of religious toleration was widely inclusive, far more so than many of his peers. He welcomed Jews back into England, albeit for his own millenarian beliefs. He was friends with the Quaker, George Fox, and fought with allies to ensure the widest range of worship was permitted under his rule. In England, provided Catholics remained loyal, he insisted on their toleration. In Ireland, he railed against Catholic clergy while insisting on toleration for ordinary Irish Catholics. Of course, tolerance for Irish Catholics didn't extend to their public worship, and the intention was always to convert Ireland to Protestantism. Policies of transplantation and transportation also took blanket approaches to Irish Catholics. The only reason that all Irish Catholics were not dispossessed and herded into a ghetto the size of Connacht was not because Cromwell stood in the way of his extremist son-in-law, Charles Fleetwood, but because appeals to humanity and also economic reality prevented it. But individual appeals from transplanted Catholic landowners were usually granted. He extended the same leniency to former royalists caught up in the decimation tax, whether they were Catholic or not. He was, of course, a brilliant military leader by any measure. His men loved him because he clearly cared about their well-being, and he was good at leading them. They trusted that he wouldn't march them into disaster through incompetence, and he led from the front. In the battles with the Long Parliament and the Rump, he showed sincere loyalty to the needs of his soldiers. He welcomed discussion, as we can see with the Army Council and in that unprecedented revolutionary moment at the Putney debates. But he would not tolerate poor discipline. He didn't hesitate to have mutinous troops shot or unsanctioned looters hanged. His more moderate preferences meant that more radical social change, through the efforts of the Levellers, did not come to pass, for good or ill. Cromwell's 2 campaigns outside of England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland, were wildly different. Scotland was a chastening experience which could have meant disaster, but he was rewarded with the miracle of Dunbar. In Ireland, Cromwell's campaign was a relentless series of victories, introducing the latest siege warfare and effective logistics to the medieval castles and cities of Ireland. It was a demonstration of Cromwell's effectiveness on all fronts, from how he prepared for the campaign, ensuring political support for the expenses he knew he'd require, to his propaganda campaign on arriving in Dublin, to his willingness to delegate to people like Lord Broghill. It's also, by far, the darkest mark on his record. He unleashed a terrible slaughter at Drogheda and didn't do enough to prevent another at Wexford. His name is attached to the largest transfer of land ownership in early modern Europe. The settlement of Ireland began while he had no formal authority over it, but it was his family members, 1 son and 2 sons-in-law, who oversaw the Tory War and the Cromwellian settlement. Hundreds of thousands died due to one Cromwell or another, and the economic and political landscape of Ireland would be changed for centuries. Come the Restoration, the clock will be turned back in England, Wales and Scotland, not so much in Ireland. The newborn Protestant ascendancy was there to stay. In his time as first Lord General of the New Model Army and then as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, England first started projecting itself as an imperial power outside of Britain and Ireland. The Anglo-Dutch War led to the reform and massive expansion of the state's navy, allowing it to go toe-to-toe and handily win battles with Europe's greatest naval power, led by some of Europe's greatest admirals. The Western design was far too ambitious, and the defeat at Hispaniola rocked Cromwell's belief that he was following God's will. But it was an unprecedented form of imperial expansion, the English state fully backing a combined force expedition to violently seize another European colony. Jamaica might have been a consolation prize, but after many years of struggle and a dramatic increase in enslaved labour, it would become England's most valuable Caribbean colony. The state's navy was a firm foundation for the future Royal Navy, and the conquest and settlement of Jamaica would provide a useful blueprint for future expansion. Like all rulers, we have to judge them on how they prepared for the transfer of power, and it is something of a mixed bag with Oliver Cromwell, because when he shuffled off his mortal coil, he left the great protectoral experiment in the hands of... who? In his final weeks, Cromwell had still not formally nominated his successor. Richard had been elevated and appeared to be his chosen heir, but nothing public had been said. Even Thurlow, close friend and knower of all, was writing to Henry Cromwell to tell him that his father had still not decided. After he died, the official story was that the day before he died, a few of the Privy Councillors, Thurlow included, went to the Lord Protector's bedside. They witnessed him declare that his son Richard would be his successor. In the hours after his death, the Privy Council met and confirmed both this story and the nomination. Richard Cromwell was thus proclaimed Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He was a relative unknown who had stayed out of the limelight until the last 2 years of his father's life. What kind of Lord Protector would he be? Would he prove the warriors wrong? Would the Protectorate survive the death of Oliver Cromwell? Could Richard Cromwell shepherd it through the existential challenges it would surely face? On the continent, the royalist court in exile perked up their ears. Was this the chance that they'd been waiting for? And in a garden in Wimbledon, retired General John Lambert was asking the same question. Next time we will see how well Richard Cromwell manages to hold together a regime which had been designed for his father. Let me know what you think about Oliver Cromwell. Do you think I've given him a fair assessment here, or not? If your podcast app allows comments, go ahead and leave one. Thank you to my members of the other house, including the King's favourite, Mike Sanders, the Duke of Bracewell, David Braswell, the Marquis of Montague, Brandon Stansbury, and the Earl of Waldegrave, Dave Gardina. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. The other best way to support the show is to tell someone about it. That's the best way to help an independent podcast like this grow. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.